The moment BTS Jungkook said the word marriage while looking at Taehyung. Nobody expected this from Jungkook. Taehyung's reaction says it all, without any announcement. Without any warning, this moment quietly shook the global scene. Welcome to V Effect. The room went silent. The cameras didn't cut and Taehyung's reaction completely changed everything. Fans are now questioning what we really just witnessed. And what you're about to see might be the most emotional moment BTS never meant to reveal. Nobody expected that word. Not from him. Not in that moment. And definitely not right there with Taehyung sitting only inches away. The interview had started light. Laughter, playful teasing. The familiar comfort that BTS always carried into any room they entered. Jungkook leaned back in his chair, arms crossed loosely, his eyes bright with that familiar shy confidence fans had grown up with. The host smiled. So what do you see for yourself in the future? Jungkook tilted his head, pretending to think. He glanced briefly at the members and then, without realizing it, his eyes landed on Taehyung just for a second, but it was long enough. I think, he said softly, marriage. The word landed like thunder. Not loud, not explosive, but heavy. As if the air itself froze around it. The room went quiet. No music, no laughter, no playful interruptions, just silence. Taehyung didn't move at first. His smile stayed frozen, eyes still on Jungkook, as if his brain needed a moment to process what his heart had already felt. Fans would later rewatch that clip frame by frame. They would slow it down, zoom in, replay it again and again, not because of what Jungkook said, but because of how Taehyung reacted. His jaw tightened slightly, his eyes softened, and for half a second, his smile faded into something unreadable, something real. The host laughed nervously. Oh, that's a serious answer. Jungkook blinked, suddenly realizing the weight of his own words. He rubbed the back of his neck, cheeks faintly red. I mean someday in the future, he added quickly, but his voice wasn't as steady anymore. Taehyung finally turned away. Not fast, not obviously, but enough for fans to notice. He pressed his lips together and nodded slowly, as if he were agreeing with something that hadn't even been said out loud. And in that tiny movement, that quiet nod, something shifted, because for the first time in a long time, the playful Taehyung looked emotional. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just quietly affected. And that was what shook fans the most. Not the word, but the silence that followed. First, most people missed it. The interview moved on. The host changed the topic. The laughter slowly returned, and on the surface, everything seemed normal again. But the cameras had already caught what mattered. After Jungkook said that word, Taehyung was no longer the same. He still smiled, he still nodded, he still joked when spoken to, but his eyes didn't laugh anymore. They kept drifting back to Jungkook again and again, as if searching for something or maybe trying to confirm what his heart had just heard. Jungkook, on the other hand, grew unusually quiet. He listened more than he spoke. He fidgeted with his rings, and every time Taehyung glanced his way, Jungkook would look down just a little too fast. Fans would later say he looks nervous, he looks emotional, he looks like he said more than he meant to. But the moment that truly broke everyone came near the end of the interview. The host asked a simple question. What makes you feel most safe these days? One by one the members answered. Then it was Jungkook's turn. He paused, not for a second, not for two, but long enough for the room to feel it. And without lifting his eyes, he said quietly, someone who understands me without me having to explain. Silence again. Not heavy this time, but tender. Taehyung inhaled sharply. It was barely audible, barely visible, but the cameras caught the way his fingers curled slightly on his knee, as if he were grounding himself in that moment. He didn't look at Jungkook, because if he did, fans were sure his face would have said everything. Instead, he whispered almost to himself, that's rare. Jungkook finally looked up. Their eyes met. Not long, not obvious, but long enough to make thousands of fans freeze their screens later. And in that look, that quiet shared second, there was something unspoken, something unfinished, something that felt like a beginning and a warning at the same time. Because after that moment, everything felt different. And fans knew this wasn't just an interview anymore. This was the start of a story no one was supposed to notice. First, it was just another interview, at least that's what people thought. The broadcast ended. The members waved. The studio lights dimmed. And for a few quiet minutes, the internet stayed calm. Then someone clipped that moment. Not the whole interview, not the jokes, not the laughter, just that single word. Marriage. Posted with a simple caption. Why did he look at Taehyung when he said this? Within an hour it was everywhere. Fans slowed the video down. They zoomed in. They circled Taehyung's expression and read. They replayed Jungkook's nervous smile frame by frame. Comments flooded in. This feels different. Why does this feel emotional? Something is going on here. And then someone noticed something else. A second clip. It was taken just seconds after the interview ended when the cameras were supposed to be off, but they weren't. Jungkook stood up from his chair, still smiling for the staff, and then his smile faded. He turned. Taehyung was already looking at him. No words, no gestures, just a quiet, steady look. Jungkook hesitated as if he wanted to say something, then simply nodded once. Taehyung nodded back. That was it, 3 seconds, and somehow it felt louder than everything that had been said on stage. That clip exploded even faster than the first one. People didn't know why it felt important, they just knew it did. Because it didn't look like a joke. It didn't look like fan service. It didn't look like acting. It looked like two people who shared a moment no one else in the room was meant to understand. And suddenly fans weren't just watching interviews anymore. They were watching expressions. They were watching glances. They were watching silences, trying to read what was never spoken out loud. And somewhere in that growing storm of edits, theories, and slowed-down clips, one question echoed louder than the rest. What did that word really mean to him? By the next morning, the internet was no longer calm. Edits filled timelines. Slow-motion replays looped endlessly. Screenshots were circled, highlighted, analyzed. But inside the building, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Jungkook sat alone in the practice room long before anyone else arrived. The lights were dim, his hoodie pulled low, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping against his knee to a rhythm only he could hear. He wasn't rehearsing. He was thinking about the word, about the look, about the silence that followed. Across the hallway, Taehyung leaned against a window, phone in his hand, screen dark. Unread messages piling up. He wasn't scrolling. He was remembering that half-second of eye contact, that quiet nod, that feeling he hadn't expected to feel. When they finally crossed paths in the hallway, neither of them said anything at first, not because they didn't want to, but because some moments don't come with easy words. Jungkook stopped walking. Taehyung did too. The air felt different. Not tense, not awkward, just aware. Jungkook cleared his throat softly. About yesterday. Taehyung lifted his eyes. He didn't rush him. He didn't interrupt. He just waited. Jungkook hesitated, then smiled, small and nervous. I didn't plan to say it like that. Taehyung nodded slowly. I know. A pause, then Taehyung added quietly. But it still meant something. Jungkook looked up, not surprised, just thoughtful. Yeah, he whispered. It did. Neither of them explained further. They didn't need to, because sometimes meaning doesn't come from long conversations. It comes from shared understanding. And in that quiet hallway, away from cameras and trending pages, something unspoken settled between them. Not as a headline, not as a rumor, but as a moment that would quietly change the way they looked at each other from that day on. After that day, something subtle changed. Not in ways cameras could easily capture, not in ways headlines could clearly explain, but in small things. Jungkook started sitting closer to Taehyung during breaks. Taehyung lingered a little longer when Jungkook finished practicing. Their jokes were still playful, but the pauses between them felt heavier, full of things left unsaid. The members noticed, not in an obvious way, but in glances exchanged across the room, in quiet smiles, in the way conversations sometimes stalled when Jungkook and Taehyung fell into their own bubble of silence. One evening, as the others packed up to leave, Taehyung stayed behind. Jungkook did too. The practice room was almost dark, lit only by the city glow slipping through the tall windows. Taehyung finally spoke. Can I ask you something? Jungkook looked up surprised. Yeah. Taehyung hesitated just for a second. When you said that word, what were you really thinking about? Jungkook didn't answer immediately. He stared at the floor, breathing slowly, choosing his words carefully. I wasn't thinking about a future, he said softly. I was thinking about a feeling. Taehyung's fingers tightened around the strap of his bag. What kind of feeling? Jungkook finally looked up. The kind that makes you feel safe. The kind that makes everything quieter. The kind that makes you stop pretending. Silence filled the room. Not awkward, not uncomfortable, just honest. Taehyung swallowed, then nodded slowly. I thought so. He didn't ask anything else. But his expression changed, softer, steadier, as if the answer, whatever it truly meant, was enough for now. They didn't make promises. They didn't define anything. But when they left the room that night, they walked side by side, closer than before, and neither of them stepped away. And somewhere between those quiet steps, a new question began to grow. Not what did that word mean, but what would it become? The schedule that week was packed. Rehearsals ran late. Meetings overlapped. Cameras followed them almost everywhere. To everyone else, BTS looked the same as always. Smiling, professional, perfectly in sync. But to fans who were watching closely, something felt different. Not obvious, just softer. Jungkook laughed a little more when Taehyung spoke. Taehyung leaned in a little closer when Jungkook whispered something. Their eyes met more often and stayed there just a beat longer than before. Then came the live stream. No scripts, no cue cards, just them, a couch, and thousands of blinking comments racing across the screen. Someone typed, "What makes you happiest these days?" The room grew playful with teasing answers. Food, sleep, music. Then Jungkook read the question out loud. He paused, smiled, and said, "Being understood." Taehyung froze just for a fraction of a second. Then he laughed softly. "Wow, that's deep." Jungkook shrugged, pretending it was nothing. But his eyes had already found Taehyung again. "Yeah," he added quietly, "it is." The chat exploded. Fans didn't know why their hearts were suddenly racing, they just felt it, because it didn't sound like a joke. It didn't sound like a casual answer. Sounded like something personal. After the live stream ended, Taehyung reached out, quick, subtle, and lightly tapped Jungkook's shoulder. "Hey." Jungkook looked at him. Taehyung smiled, small and real. "I get it." And for a second, just a quiet, camera-free second, Jungkook's smile softened into something that wasn't meant for anyone else to see. Something honest, something calm, something that didn't need to be explained. Because sometimes being understood is already everything. They never talked about it directly. Not in clear sentences, not in defined labels, not in promises anyone could quote, but something had settled quietly between them, something steady. It showed in the way Taehyung waited for Jungkook after practice, pretending to check his phone even though his screen was already dark. In the way Jungkook instinctively reached for the seat beside Taehyung without even thinking. In the way their laughter sounded a little softer when it was just the two of them. One late evening, they found themselves alone again in the practice room. No staff, no cameras, no noise except the hum of the city beyond the windows. Jungkook sat on the floor, back against the mirror, staring at his reflection. Taehyung sat beside him. Close but not touching. "Not yet. Do you ever feel like," Jungkook began, voice quiet, "some things don't need to be said to be real?" Taehyung didn't answer immediately. He leaned back, looking up at the ceiling. "Yeah," he finally replied. "Some things feel stronger when they stay quiet." Jungkook nodded. Then slowly he reached out his hand, stopping just short of Taehyung's. Not touching, just there, an unspoken question. Taehyung looked down at it. And after a heartbeat, he moved his hand too. Their fingers brushed, just barely. Not dramatic, not rushed, but intentional. Neither of them pulled away. Neither of them spoke. Because in that small, simple moment, something felt decided without ever being said out loud. Not as a headline, not as a rumor, not as a confession, but as a quiet promise. The kind that lives in silence.